A special warm welcome to Ambassador Pence, our speaker tonight. I will be acting as chairman of this meeting, standing in for Matti Vanhanen, who will have to leave us to his ministerial duties earlier this evening, but he is with us for the beginning of the meeting. And this is a hybrid meeting, which means that hundreds, if not thousands of people will be following our direct streaming, but following the presentation by Ambassador Pence, we will close the cameras and we will have the possibility to follow on Chatham House rules the discussion here in place. The audience today is comprised of the board of the Paasikivi Society, but our membership will be following online this speech. And it's a great honor for me to give a warm welcome to Robert Pence, the Ambassador of the United States of America. Ambassador Pence is a well-known figure. He is the founder and chairman of the board of the Pence Group, a full-serving service development company, and he's also active board member of the Gary Sinise Foundation, and he has served on the boards of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Wolf Trap Foundation, World Affairs Council, George Mason University, and American University. And he is also lectured at Georgetown University and has been a teaching fellow at Yale University. His BA is from the University of Maryland. He has a JD degree and 2 MAs from the American University, Master of Philosophy and MA degrees from the Yale University, and his dissertation has been on Dante Alighieri. We would very much welcome the opportunity to listen to you on Dante Alighieri, but this is not the subject that we will be addressing tonight, because your speech has been titled as the USA, Finland and EU in the changing world. So we'll be listening to your remarks with great interest and looking forward to a good and open discussion after your remarks. So, Ambassador Pence, please, you have the floor.
Hyvää iltaa. That good? Mr. Tuomioja, members of the Paasikivi Society, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for offering me the opportunity to be here tonight and to speak to you. It is an honor and pleasure. Susie, my wife, and I love being here in Finland. We love Finland. We've grown to really admire the society, your institutions, your passions. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk tonight, indeed, about the United States, Finland, and the EU in a changing world. I would be remiss, my first digression, actually it's in my text. My muse Cicero commands that I be brief and to the point. I shall try, but I'm no match for Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson. And so I begin with a brief quote from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, remembering that when he gave it, a lot of people came a couple minutes late, and it was only about 2 minutes long. I cannot compete with that. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And Gettysburg, obviously, was the really deciding battle in the American Civil War. And so, on that theme, I will digress with a sentence or two, because I'm going to dedicate this speech to Dale Wairainen, whom you probably don't know, but on May the 18th, 1967, he was a specialist fourth class in the United States Army in Vietnam. And they went to rescue some of his compatriots, and they were ambushed, and a grenade was thrown in their midst, and he jumped on it, and he was killed. 2 years later, he received the Medal of Honor. He paid the price, and I would be remiss, because I have often said in Finland and mentioned the fact that there were, in history, 5 Finnish men who moved from Finland to the United States and subsequently served in our armed forces and received the Medal of Honor. Mr. Wairainen was not born in Finland, but both of his parents were. You grow them pretty good. There's another quote I'd like to start out with, to add, because it is equally relevant here tonight. It comes from the Declaration of Independence that one John Morton signed. As a matter of fact, he was the decisive vote in the Pennsylvania delegation that led to the Declaration. It goes something like this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government." Separate quote. "But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide a new government. A tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people." I do have a quote from Dante built in here. I would be remiss not to say one thing. And it comes from Paradiso 19, the last section of Dante's great Divine Comedy. And therein he's treating of mercy and justice. And he says, I quote, translation into English, "There one there in paradise shall see the thirst of arrogance that drives the Scot and Englishman insane and unable to remain within their borders." We're going to talk about borders tonight, and my point is tyrants abusing, exceeding their own borders and warring on their neighbors figures prominently in the problems of the world today. Every generation faces its own challenges. Some have greater challenges than others. Clearly, today we find ourselves in a period of great change, and COVID-19 reminds us all just how quickly change can occur. Our challenge is, how do we go from where we are to where we want to be? What is the role of the United States and Finland and the European Union in this great voyage of history? How do we strengthen the West against the challenges of authoritarian regimes like the People's Republic of China and Russia? I recognize our difficulties are not limited to Beijing and Moscow. Iran and North Korea, for example, present their own challenges. But I do want to focus tonight on great power issues and how we resolve disagreements. In this evolving world, I want to stress how successful the world is that the United States, together with its partners and allies like the EU, and yes, today Finland, built after World War II. It's been a very trying experience. The world that the United States and Finland and the EU and all like-minded, hard-working men and women have created is a world worth preserving. And the United States is working to preserve the very best of our shared values. In that vein, I want to stress the very good news that the United States and Finland enjoy a frank, fruitful, and wide-ranging engagement. Just last year, we celebrated 100 years of diplomatic relations, marking a lasting relationship between friends. I note that this year I enjoyed my 75th birthday, which is to say I've been around for 3/4 of the length that you have been an independent nation. You've been a nation for time immemorial. I would also point out the American Embassy has worked with the Finnish Embassy in Washington diligently over a period of years, certainly the time that I've been here, plus the modest period of time it took me to get here, with the Finnish Embassy in Washington on a joint photo exhibit which toured the United States and Finland. That was an unusual process, but it achieved great outreach and was very poignant, and people loved it. And not just Finns, everywhere we went. In America, they loved learning about Finland, and I do believe that your countrymen and women have enjoyed it as well. More recently, our two great republics have further deepened our relationship. In 2017, Presidents Niinistö and Trump first met in Washington. First met in Washington. First met in Washington. Then President Niinistö hosted the historic meeting between President Trump and himself, President Trump and Putin in Helsinki in 2018. Then it was back to Washington in 2019 for the latest meeting of Presidents Niinistö and Trump, and I would add a baseball game between Bob Pence and President Niinistö. Hot dogs and beer, that's not in here. During all of these visits, we have looked for ways to better serve and protect our citizens, like countering false narratives, protecting our democratic institutions, and promoting U.S.-Finnish bilateral relations, including trade, security, and investment. In short, our very way of life. We each value the significant trade between our nations, more than 6 billion euros worth of trade in 2019 alone. Two great American firms are competing to provide the next generation of fighter aircraft and weapons of Finland. I wish I had a vote, but we'll see how that comes out. I'm sure Finland will make the best decision for itself. Finland's contributions to regional security are equally highly valued. Over the past several years, the United States has signed 2 statements of intent on defense cooperation, one bilaterally with Finland and the other trilaterally with Finland and Sweden. I cannot think of a clearer demonstration of the value we place on our partnership. I'm often asked about NATO. My answer is always the same. The United States fully respects Finland's choices as a militarily non-aligned nation that includes Finland's decision to join or not to join NATO. The door is open, and that will remain open. The United States is one of the most active advocates of Finland's enhanced opportunity partner status with NATO. And I want to thank Finland for its contributions to NATO operations, such as the Kosovo Force and Operation Resolute support in Afghanistan, as well as contributions in Iraq of both military and civilian police trainers. I now want to share a few thoughts with you about how the United States views Europe, the transatlantic relationship, how we should address new threats, and what that means for Finland, the European Union, and all of our European allies, partners, and friends. This year we commemorate 75 years since the end of World War II. The transatlantic relationship and the post-war international order have fueled over 7 decades of security and mutual prosperity. Poverty has fallen. Our citizens are living longer, healthier lives. The transatlantic community shares a $1.1 trillion economy, or over half of the world's GDP. The European Union and the greater European community are essential to this remarkable achievement. The EU's shared commitment to foundational democratic values, human rights, rule of law, and an independent judiciary, a free press, and free markets not only was instrumental to ensuring a Europe whole, free, and at peace, but it also underpinned international economic institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and the WTO. Those institutions and more enshrined free market principles which guided post-war recovery and made post-war growth possible. We accomplished this together, and in so doing, our strategic interests have become more profoundly and tightly intertwined. So, what few differences we may have, I think historically, culturally, and geopolitically, there is and always will be a very deep bond that ties both sides of the Atlantic together. We share the same values and look at the world in similar ways. We struggle with the same questions. We don't always reach the same answers, but we each benefit from the vigorous, open debate that the transatlantic relationship ensures. I now want to address some new challenges. But we do now face a very different world, one defined by renewed great power competition and complex, rapidly changing technologies. Old paradigms do not always work in this era of malign state actors who undermine our shared values, democratic systems, and international norms. The truth is that Russia and the PRC each, in its own way, seeks to create dependencies through military power, economic leverage, and cultural influence. I want to mention the Yale World Fellows Program. Thanks for the introduction comment, getting Yale into this. In 2010, this program had 1,000 applicants. It took in 15 participants in the Fellows Program. One of them was named Alexei Navalny. I just finished a book over the weekend, Dan Silva's The English Girl, a novel. In the notes at the end, factual notes, where he sets forth what he fabricated and what was real life, I found a very interesting note. I quote, not from the fiction part, but from the real note at the end. Now it appears the Kremlin has set its sights on Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent dissident and a leader of the protest movement that swept the country after Putin's return to the presidency. At the time of this writing, Navalny is awaiting trial on embezzlement charges he and the legion of supporters have denounced as politically motivated. If convicted, he faces the prospect of spending 10 years in prison, where he would be no threat to Putin and his fellow Siloviki, hope I said that right, Siloviki, in the Kremlin. That's from The English Girl. The book was written in 2013. Pretty prescient, because later in that year he was convicted. And we all know what's happened to him recently in Russia, and fortunately he's out of his coma now in Germany. But the lessons to be learned from such activities on the part of Russia and its leader They're not positive. The Russians are not dependable. They're not a viable working force for peace in the United Nations. It has not complied with the Helsinki Accords, or the Minsk Agreements, or the INF Treaty, or the Open Skies Treaty. The list goes on and on and on. Unfortunately, the phrase that President Ford uttered upon the signing of the Helsinki Accords still holds true. Peace is not a piece of paper. I have a nice picture of President Ford and Mr. Brezhnev in the dining room of the house where I reside. And I think it's fair to say that the PRC has yet to take seriously the commitments it made when it was brought into the World Trade Organization, nor, as we can see on the nightly news, its commitment to the residents of Hong Kong. The PRC is a rising force, not only in Asia, but in almost every corner of the world. China systematically abuses the rules of international trade and seeks increased leverage and dependencies globally, including Europe. I want to stress a point often overlooked. Like Finland, America has a long and positive history with China. Today it's different. But America helped free China from Japanese aggression in World War II. We both engaged heavily with the PRC after the Cold War. The U.S. has provided military and intelligence assistance. We made generous technology transfers. We ensured preferential trade and investment access. We sponsored and arranged for vast educational exchanges, and I would add, at great cost to otherwise very well qualified American citizen students. We provided development financing and organized government-to-government capacity building. We hoped that the more we interacted, the more it would become a liberal democracy. As you know, that has not happened. We were wrong. My own personal summary since I went into business in 1976 is this. America has traded much of its industrial commercial might for cheap prices at Walmart. Remember, if you will, that my career is building shopping centers. Secretary Pompeo said it well. We accommodated and encouraged China's rise for decades, even when that rise was at the expense of American values, Western democracy, security, and good common sense. Under its president, the PRC is moving in the wrong direction. More repression, more human rights violations, more unfair competition, more predatory economic practices, and, as if all this is not enough, a more aggressive military posture. I would add another slight digression. As well, the Indians know right now on their border with the PRC. Furthermore, the Chinese Communist Party-sponsored actors are creating vulnerabilities they use to undermine national and international institutions, to increase their influence, and to exert control over our free societies. For example, the PRC's investments in Europe since 2008 have increased by a factor of nearly 50. In Finland alone, PRC investments amounted to 12 billion euros. PRC-based firms went from controlling only about 5,000 firms in 2007 to more than 28,000 in 2017. I think my team needs to tell me what that geographic area is. In 2008, the PRC invested less than $1 billion in Europe. Less than $1 billion. Just 9 years later, in 2017 in Europe, Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe was $42 billion. And total investment in Europe, both mergers and acquisitions, approximated $318 billion. In recent years, the PRC has taken control of 360 European companies and now owns or controls almost a tenth of Europe's entire port capacity. It is just not ports that America is worried about. For over a decade now, PRC state-sponsored actors have offered their cargo screening technologies to European governments at below-market prices, and in some cases have even gifted equipment. The downward pressure on prices has driven true free market competition out of the market. Ironically, the very same free markets the technologies are intended to protect. Technology provided by state-sponsored, untrusted vendors can now be found in airports and on land borders throughout Europe. Those technologies, offered at rock-bottom prices, will leave Europe vulnerable to surveillance of everything that crosses your borders. It is especially troubling that now the PRC is seeking to buy companies in strategic sectors suffering from the impact of COVID-19 at fire sale prices. In consequences of its policies, the PRC is now a major player in Europe. It uses death trap diplomacy to accumulate infrastructure and to force concessions on smaller nations, the word smaller being a relative term. Such tactics mirror Chinese behavior at the international level, where Beijing engages in unfair trade practices, including forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, economic espionage, and dumping. I want to be very clear. We are not saying you should not do business with the PRC. The United States, Finland, and the EU should find ways to cooperate when our interests converge. For example, President Trump completed a major trade deal with Beijing. It was signed in January and was a good deal for the United States and the PRC. And these economic ties were powerful. They are important parties, but only if the signatories perform the obligations that they have themselves willingly undertaken. And I mean all of them. But we must be realistic. We face the world as it is. We must do so. In Europe, we have urged our allies to take more responsibility for the cost of strengthening the West and working to recalibrate international institutions to better address new strategic realities. The United States does not seek, nor have we ever sought, to create dependencies in Europe. We seek mutually beneficial relations with strong nation states based on freedom, liberty, and shared responsibilities. Finland, to be sure, is doing its part. And so we must turn our attention to strengthening the West in order to better resist our rivals and to support nations that are struggling to remain independent. It's very evident now, as it was in Dante's time, that there are countries which will not stay within their own borders. That's a very sad fact. The dangers to Ukraine and Georgia are direct, existential, and real. Now we can add Belarus. They compromise both military threats to territorial integrity and sovereignty, and efforts to unravel the democratic institutions that their citizens are attempting to build. Those countries have been through the process that Jefferson spoke about in the Declaration of Independence. The previous government was not responsive to the needs of the people. They changed it, and now the tyrant, who should not rule the people, is ruling them and is attempting to rule others. To Europe, the threat is of a degree of political and economic penetration that, if left unchecked, could degrade national independence. In short, Europe is once again an arena of major geopolitical competition and needs to be treated as such. Addressing these challenges requires active and creative diplomacy. The West must continue to use bilateral and multilateral diplomacy to support our values. We also need to up our game in commercial diplomacy. For the PRC and Russia, promoting commerce is an integral part of diplomacy. We need to implement our own full court press. For nearly 20 years, despite its WTO membership, despite America's efforts to build on our long and positive history with the PRC, and despite our consistently expressed concerns about the PRC's policies supporting the transfer of emerging, sensitive, and foundational technologies. Beijing is engaged in unfair trade practices, including large-scale theft of intellectual property and economic espionage. That much we know. Furthermore, under the PRC's national intelligence law, all citizens and all companies are required to, quote, support, assist, and cooperate with the state intelligence work, sharing, end quote, sharing not only technology but also data, information, and access to systems, and not just with the military, but also with intelligence services, and to keep that work secret. Accordingly, we must focus our attention on safeguarding 5G wireless networks. The United States has very serious concerns in this area, very serious, and we welcome the EU's 5G security toolbox. But a better answer is right here before us. Europe has not one, but two 5G solutions, and Nokia is not just any Finnish company. It is one of the best-known companies in the world. And so I ask you, given the choice you have, why would you want to use why would you not want to use European technology developed by European companies to protect European citizens and to promote European values? What am I missing? An overarching theme of our recent engagement with Europe has been that we need Europe to take great power competition seriously in two ways. First, to take yet more seriously the risk to Europe, such as from the PRC and Russia, and second, to share burdens. Let me touch on three separate aspects of this. First, rebalancing the transatlantic trade relationship plays a central role in this discussion and in this process. Any future trade discussions with the EU must address disparities in both tariff and non-tariff. Secondly, we seek to strengthen European burden sharing, particularly in NATO. All of you know from the public messaging and debate how important this is for the Trump administration. More to the point, President Trump is the third U.S. president to emphasize the need for burden sharing. Please make no mistake, this issue is not going to go away. Let me add, with genuine appreciation, that Finland, after completing its new aircraft acquisition, will exceed, I repeat for emphasis in the best Ciceronian rhetorical tradition, I repeat, will exceed the 2% level even though it is not a NATO member. Thank you. Thirdly, we must reduce European dependency on Russia. I think President Trump is correct when he says that it is unsupportable for European allies to nurture deep strategic dependencies on the very power that the United States, NATO, and other like-minded free societies are being called upon to counter. Regarding European energy security, our emphasis has been on increasing diversification, including natural gas, nuclear renewables, and LNG. The use of coal continues to fall dramatically. We urge our European friends to rethink Nord Stream 2, and I note in the paper yesterday that Ms. Merkel in Germany is in fact advocating a review of that very possibility as a result of Putin/Russia's crass transgressions to the international order. As President Nishtu noted in his December 11th speech at the opening of the Baltic Connector, the diversification of energy sources improves security for all. The United States is glad that the Baltic Connector allows Finland to take important steps in establishing a regional gas market, which, as President Niinistö said, quote, moves us closer to the development of genuine EU-wide gas network and market, end quote. You understand the threat from Russia well. You understand how well Russia has chosen to comply and to not comply with its international obligations. And let me state clearly tonight, United States appreciation for and admiration of Finland's continued adherence to the EU line on Russia sanctions. We know this was not an easy decision. The sanctions are a great example of what we can accomplish together and why we must continue to strengthen U.S.-European unity. To that end, a number of European-led initiatives seek to increase cooperation on the continent and to develop European solutions to replace aging equipment. We support these efforts. The European Defense Fund, PESCO, both seek to develop European solutions to fill capability gaps, to help Europe to invest more in its own security, and to fulfill NATO's Wales Pledge. However, all such efforts must be also consider the transatlantic dimensions of European security. The Arctic. This is a subject that I love, even before I came here. We need to continue our productive and multilateral work with Finland and other partners on the Arctic Council. As Secretary Pompeo underscored in Rovaniemi last year, the good work that the Arctic Council was engaged in must continue. The United States understands how important the Arctic is and has no desire to see our effective cooperative activities end. We're looking at ways to build and enhance our cooperation. Perhaps some of you know how engaged I've been on the question of icebreakers, for instance. At the same time, we must adjust our Arctic policy to reflect today's new reality, a strategic change driven by Russia and the PRC's desire to rearrange the global order for their advantage. We should expect the rapidly changing Arctic system, diminishing sea ice coverage, declining snow cover, melting ice sheets, and thawing permafrost to create opportunities and incentives that Russia and the PRC will pursue. Those agendas clash with our interests. This risks our collective efforts to ensure the Arctic remains a region of rules-based governance and less tension. The PRC represents somewhat of a different challenge, an additional challenge. Its stated interests in the Arctic are primarily focused on access to natural resources and the opportunities offered by the Arctic sea routes for shipping. Last year, they pretty fairly and expressly called themselves an Arctic country, a near-Arctic nation, although Secretary Pompeo noted, I think, that 600, 900 miles is the closest point that China has to the Arctic Circle. This is discouraging. What they're trying to do is discouraging in two ways. First, and to be clear, there are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. And the PRC, here it is, thank you, whose closest point is about 900 miles or 1,150 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle, is in the latter category. Secondly, the PRC often disregards international norms and agreements, as it has in the South China Sea. The United States is not arguing that Chinese economic investment or scientific research in the Arctic is unwelcome. We welcome transparent, rules-based engagement with the PRC, but the United States and its Arctic allies and partners must examine the PRC's activities much more closely than we have in the past. The PRC's behavior over the last decade underscores that we cannot and should not assume good intentions. The United States wants to be a partner of choice in the Arctic by increasing investments and our engagement with partners. We will continue the good work and strong cooperation through the Arctic Council. I'm sure we surprised a few people when the Secretary came here last year. Well, I would say continue to welcome him. The Arctic Council is a body that has directly contributed to the region's long history of peace and stability. Finland has been, is, and must remain a leader in these efforts. A final note, I am remembered of the saying that the pessimist sees an obstacle in every opportunity. The optimist sees an opportunity in every obstacle. Well, I am by nature optimistic. I think we have now, today, in this moment, tremendous opportunities, plural, to shape for the better our lives and our children's lives. I want to point out that the theme tonight is United States, Finland, the EU, and a changing world. This is my conclusion, and I must drive it home. The United States, Finland, and the EU are not just in a changing world. We have changed the world for the better for everyone. I firmly believe that we will continue to do so together and in the future. And I will add one last line because I want to go back to John Morton and another member of his delegation from Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin. And when it came to signing the Declaration of Independence, it was good old Ben that said, I paraphrase, it's not an absolute quote, we're either going to hang together or we're going to hang separately. And I remember President Niinistő's speech at Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve, right before I got here, which means 2017, where the theme of his speech was together, what we're going to do. I'll adopt it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.